Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today's story begins with an email from a subscriber. Her name is Tanya Bryan, and Tanya sent me a wartime portrait, this image here, of her ancestor, David Braley, who served in the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery. Tanya wants to know if I could tell by looking at the photograph if, in fact, it is really David Braley. So I took a look, and here's what I found. I want to share it with you in this episode. The image itself is pretty amazing. The quality, the focal quality is absolutely perfect. If you look at this image close up, you're going to see his cartridge box plate, his waist belt plate. Everything is super crisp. It's exactly what you would want to see in a Civil War portrait. This happens to be a hard plate image. It's either a tintype or an ambrotype. It's housed in a beautiful case. And of course, the soldier here, as you can plainly see, is holding his musket. He is wearing that cartridge box. He has his Union uniform on, the dark color, and the standard trim tells me that he's a Union soldier, and also the cap that he's holding. I want to take a look at that cap because it is probably the most important clue to David Braley's identity. So what I did is I flipped the image because tintypes and ambrotypes were actually taken in reverse. So it showed the opposite as if you're looking at the individual through a mirror or in a mirror. So I flipped it and then I rotated the image so you could see the cap straight up. Now, notice on the cap, the large letter B, that is his company letter. Look below that and you'll see two smaller numbers, and that's 18. So we can say that he served in Company B of the 18th Regiment. Now, recall that Tanya mentioned he served in the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery. Well, at first glance, it seems like we have a conflict here because the record, the number and letter on his cap clearly says B18. So I take a look at the regiment and take a look at his history and Civil War records. And in fact, David Braley enlisted as a private in Company B of the 18th Maine Infantry in 1862. In 1863, the 18th was redesignated as the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery. So, in fact, Tanya, you're correct. This is, in fact, David Braley. I believe it to be him because of the company letter and the regimental number. It all matches up. On top of that, David Braley enlisted when he was 29 years old, a little older than the average age. And if you look closely at his face, you'll see that he certainly isn't, he's not an 18 or 19-year-old, but he's also not in his 30s. So just an observation, I would say that his face and his look probably makes him about 29. That seems like a reasonable connection. So getting that out of the way, if you're a student of the Civil War, like I am, when you hear the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery, it should send shivers up your spine. And I'll tell you why. Let's first go to William F. Fox, who authored a book called Regimental Losses in the American Civil War. Fox's book has a section called the 300 Fighting Regiments. These are, in fact, the 300 fighting regiments in the Union Army that sustained the most casualties during the war. And if you look up the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery in Fox's book, you're going to find the first paragraph says this: of the 2,047 regiments in the Union Army, the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery sustained the greatest loss in battle. Not only was the number killed the largest, but the percentage of killed was exceeded in only one instance. Again, its loss at Petersburg, June 18th, was the greatest of any one regiment in any one action during the war. It made the charge that day with about 900 muskets, losing 632 in killed and wounded. Not going to stop there. I'm going to go back to David Braley here for a moment. Braley served throughout the entire war, mustering out in July 1865. He was wounded once, and that was at Petersburg on June 18th, 1864, making him one of the estimated 632 men of the regiment who became casualties on that day. It's even more fascinating to me and more tragic in some ways when you know that the 1st Maine spent most of the early part of the war in the defenses of Washington, like many of the heavy artillery regiments, nicknamed the Heavies. And the defenses, these big regiments that pretty much protected the capital, and we give them great credit for that. They had very little field service until the Overland campaign in the spring of 1864, when Grant was desperate for men to bulk up the Army of the Potomac to take on General Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. So a lot of these heavies left the defenses of Washington, came down to the Army of the Potomac in Virginia, and then headed south with the Army to face Lee's men. Folks like David Braley, while they had plenty of experiences in the defenses of Washington, had seen little of actual camp and campaign. So here they were in for some really difficult times. Now, if you turn to the regimental history, it's nicely written, of the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery by Captain Horace H. Shaw. There's about a page and a little bit more that describes June 18th, 1864. And I want to read it to you because it will give you some context. It will give you a sense of how brutal and how difficult it was for David Braley and all of his comrades that day. You're going to notice a little discrepancy in the numbers. Captain Shaw lists about 850 men going into the battle, and Fox has about 900 listed. At any rate, let me read this to you. Here we go. There is no doubt that the general attack upon the Confederate lines was intended by the commanding general to be made very much earlier, probably on the night of the 15th, or as soon as troops could be gotten into position. But one delay after another had disappointed him, and by the morning of the 18th, when the grand charge was to be ordered on Petersburg, the new conditions and new Confederate works that had arisen in the night so changed the aspect of affairs that the final order was not given until late in the afternoon. The charge was ordered to be made along the entire front. The 1st Maine had been designated as the center or storming column. They were posted in a portion of Old Prince George Courthouse Road, where that road made a sharp turn to the right, running northwest past Old Newmarket Racecourse and nearly parallel with the enemy's lines of works, about 500 yards distant from them. At this point, this road, partly a plank road, was dug into the ground, the dirt thrown up at the sides, a common method of making roads in Virginia. The embankments being covered with small trees and bushes a portion of the way, thus affording a good shelter from bullets and shell during the period of waiting for orders. Our regiment was ordered to charge in 3 lines, its 3 battalions, commanded by its 3 majors, Shepherd, Crossman, and Captain W.S. Clark were formed in that order, 850 strong, the whole under command of Major R.H. Shepard, made ready for the word to advance. Our Colonel Daniel Chaplin commanded the brigade, the writer serving as his aide. Artillery was posted upon the high ground in the rear and a little to the left where it could fire over the heads of the troops until they were near the enemy's lines. The first line were to clear away the abatis and gain the ditch. The second line were to follow closely after them, keeping the enemy from their works, while the first line were making ready for the rush, and to follow in immediately to assist the first line in driving the enemy out. Third line to follow the others. The whole division was to advance at the same time to draw the fire of the enemy and keep them off the parapets, to seize the enemy's works in their front as soon as a break was made in the center. The period of waiting for the word seemed an eternity. There was probably not a staff officer in Mott's division, that's Gershom Mott, the division commander, who had seen those lines that did not feel that the undertaking was well nigh impossible at this hour. But the first main officers and men were soldiers. The first duty of a soldier is obedience to orders. When this order came, they obeyed it with alacrity. 500 yards across an open field in plain sight of the enemy, within easy range of their artillery, posted along their works, a mile in length, and across the river in position to rake the field. They must run before they could reach the enemy's lines. If the attack had been made promptly by our troops, all along the line as ordered, the enemy would have plenty to attend to in their immediate front. But the veteran troops on the right and left had not forgotten their experience in assailing breastworks at the Wilderness, at Spotsylvania, and at Cold Harbor. They did indeed rush forward at the order, but the fire was so terrific in their faces that they fell back into their breastworks. The first Maine continued their advance, rushing for the front. The enemy's firing along their whole line was now centered into this field. The earth was literally torn up with iron and lead. The field became a burning, seething, crashing, hissing hell in which human courage, flesh, and bone were struggling with an impossibility, either to succeed or to return with much hope of life. So, in 10 minutes, those who were not slaughtered had returned to the road or were lying prostrate upon that awful field of carnage. The firing from the enemy's lines and from the Union lines was constantly kept up, so that those who were wounded must be wounded again or killed by flying missiles. When night came on, a dense mist settled over the field. Some of the wounded who could crawled into the lines. Some were rescued by their brave comrades who went to them in the darkness. Every attempt was made to rescue was equal to the hazards of an ordinary hard-fought battle. And there you have it, the destruction, the courage of these men marching into battle, 900 strong, the first Maine, the men of the first Maine, heavy artillery, men like David Braley, who marched into the defenses of Petersburg to try to break through, losing 632 men, casualties, 2/3 of their number in the space of minutes. So, Tanya, there you have it. I believe this is very much David Braley. And for all of you students of the Civil War, whether you were new to your studies or have been doing it for a while, a little bit more on the first Maine heavy artillery, earlier first known as the 18th Maine. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.